Wilderness designations lead into the assimilation movement of indigenous people and the colonization of indigenous people.
Welcome to Unblocked. This series of podcasts is part of the Florida International University Commons for Justice, Race, Risk, and Resilience Mellon Grant Project, and on this podcast, we aim to discuss disaster exposures, vulnerabilities, and resilience from an Indigenous perspective. We are here at Betty Osceola's family camp in the Everglades. We're sitting next to a beautiful fire that she just started, and she just explained to us that the fire is an important practice that is done by Miccosukee and other indigenous groups because it indicates that an important conversation is about to be had, and we are very grateful that it was lit for us, and we're very honored to be here in this space. Betty is an internationally recognized environmental advocate and educator who has painstakingly advocated for the protection of the Everglades. Betty's a member of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida in the Panther Clan, and she's been at the forefront of the fight to extend and protect the wildlife corridor that runs through Florida. She's been featured in a very long list of documentaries, including the Emmy Award documentary Women of the Watershed and another Emmy Award-winning documentary, Path of the Panther, which you can find streaming on Disney+. Betty has also been the recipient of multiple awards for her work protecting the environment. Today, we are here talking about a matter that is critically important to the tribe and a matter that's also deeply personal for Betty. A wildlife designation is being proposed, and it will displace many members of the tribe. So at the beginning of this podcast, you'll hear Betty pulling up some maps of that proposed wildlife designation, and she's showing us where that designation cuts into her bedroom, literally. Miccosukee holds ceremonies in some of the areas that are in the wildlife designation proposal. And in preparation for these ceremonies, they will often stay in those spaces in advance for days or even months. And blocking all people from this proposed area is really a way of blocking people from their cultural practices. So you'll hear Betty discussing the ways that Miccosukee have been practical and spiritual caretakers of the land throughout much of South Florida, and how this new designation will yet again displace Miccosukee. In this episode, Betty will also discuss the history of serial displacements of indigenous people in South Florida, and she will discuss the ways that she challenges many conservationist beliefs that ultimately claim wildlife preserves that are free of human contact are healthier. Instead, Betty insists that original stewards of the land need to be present and active on the land in order to heal the ecosystems, and that they need to be actively involved in creating solutions for true preservation.
You know, the Big Cypress National Preserve was created to stop the building of one of the largest airports in the United States. It's supposed to be to service Collier-Dade County. Mm-hmm. And at that time, there were many more people that lived out here that were fighting the building of that airport. Residents, whether they were indigenous people or non-indigenous people, hunters, fisher people, indigenous people, conservationists, environmentalists, all walks of life banded together to stop the building of that airport. And then that's how the idea to turn this into a preserve, not a park, but a preserve, was born. I was a child at that time, and I had to translate for my mother and my elders and go to the meetings to translate to my family. Plus, they didn't read and write, many of them, the elders, and to let them know what was in writing and what was being said. And I recall during those numerous meetings, there were meetings after meetings after meetings, that the tribal people were told that they were not going to be removed, that with the creation of the preserve, that we would remain here, because we asked, we have seasonal homes. So we have camps that we don't occupy all the time, but we occupy periodically. And we were told that those areas would be protected, that we would be able to go and reoccupy those areas. So with the creation of the Big Cypress National Preserve, in the enabling legislation, it allowed hunting and fishing, and it even allowed oil extraction, because the owners kept their mineral rights. And also in that legislation, there's specific language written to protect the Miccosukees and the Seminoles, because Congress at the time realized the significance of not evicting the indigenous people in order to create a preserve. Because maybe hindsight 2020, when they created Everglades National Park, they evicted the indigenous people to create the park. But here in the preserve, in the language, protects the indigenous people. So with the wilderness designation that is being proposed, would undo that promise that Congress made to the indigenous people, basically trying to force Congress to break a promise that they made to our people. Congress created the National Preserve, the Big Cypress National Preserve, to be a preserve, to allow activities in the preserve that are not normally allowed in a national park. If a wilderness designation is passed, that area would have to be managed like a national park. And also, too, when you have an area that's designated as wilderness, then they are required to again do another study to the adjacent lands to see if those adjacent lands qualify to be designated as wilderness designation. So in time, the entire Big Cypress National Preserve could be turned in to a park. And there's actually congressional testimony, I understand, from Nathaniel Reed, Superintendent Pedro Ramos at the time. There were conversations in the state of Florida as well, that they were assured that there was not going to be any intent to turn the preserve into a park. And there's also, I believe, congressional testimony and on the federal level as well, that there was not going to be an intent to turn the preserve into a park. And so you're at my family's home, and here we are. Let's see, let me zoom in here. So my personal place where I go to sleep at night is right here. Dropped another pin. Is within the boundaries of the Big Cypress National Preserve. So if a wilderness designation were proposed, myself, along with the 15 other Indian villages that's in the Big Cypress National Preserve, would be impacted, and eventually we would all be evicted. Also, too, in the proposed designated area, you're going to see another settlement where we hold ceremonies. It's away from the highway. Mm-hmm. And then there's another area much further back south of the Tamiami Trail where tribal members, Miccosukee or Seminole or descendants, travel on an annual basis to occupy that area. Could be months before the ceremony, some during the ceremony, and after the ceremony, where we stay out there. So in a proposed wilderness designation, you can't have permanent structures. So over time, the indigenous people would lose their ceremonial sites as well. This is historical ceremonial sites. The way we do those ceremonies can only be done in the natural world around us. So here we are in 2024. Apparently it started back in 2015, a movement that a little bit at a time, this preserve eventually will become a park through the efforts of wilderness designation. And one thing that is a lot of the public don't understand, if an area is studied and meet whatever they consider eligibility for wilderness designation, even if it's not formally designated, the park can manage those areas as if it were already designated.
Wow.
And that's a contention I understand when I watched the congressional hearing where Congress is questioning how the Park Service on their own can manage an area as if it were wilderness without Congress putting that designation.
So this is something that I think it's a very complicated situation, and so a lot of our listeners probably don't know a lot of the backstory. So this is a history of like serial displacements, right? Of well-meaning people who are like, okay, we're going to stop in the first case, we're going to stop this airport. And now in this case, these supposedly good, well-meaning people are like, we want to stop oil drilling. And so that's why we're doing it, right? Because some listeners might say, why are they doing this? What's the reasoning behind this?
Well, even in the creation of the preserve, the Big Cypress National Preserve, those individuals that were helping fighting it, a lot of them lived out here, and they weren't indigenous people,
right?
And they were not told, and they were not aware, with the creation of the preserve, that they would have forced removal of those public citizens. And so there was many years of people being, if they weren't grandfathered in, if they weren't here before 1972, that they had to move. Either they can move willingly and accept, pennies on the dollar,
right,
payment from the government for their land, or be taken by eminent domain. So some of the people who chose to fight it got their land taken anyway. It wasn't stopped. So, and that's another thing. At the time when this was proposed by whomever that the preserve could be created, none of those individuals were told that, okay, if we create the preserve, we're going to evict you.
Right.
I imagine if they were told that, they probably wouldn't have been in favor of creating the preserve.
Right.
So hindsight is 2020. So here we are with well-meaning people saying that they need to do the wilderness designation to stop oil drilling. They do not need to do that.
Right.
The Miccosukee tribe, going on 4 years now, maybe almost 5 years, have been working diligently with a nonprofit, Wild Landscapes International, to get the mineral rights purchased. And the largest mineral rights holder is Collier Resources, the Collier family. They are the largest mineral rights owner. They have agreed to sell their mineral rights. And following the Department Interior's rigorous process to do the evaluation, took a long time. And that process, once it's fully finalized, the goal is trying to put that appraisal before Congress for their 2026 budget for acquisition of those rights. But also Congress, from the revenue that is generated from taxing the oil industry or the extraction industry, from that money that is assessed on those industries is put into account. And Congress has a short list of what projects they're going to fund with those monies. They always come up with a list. So the Miccosukee tribe is working very diligently with Wild Landscapes International that the acquisition of those mineral rights make it to that short list for Congress to earmark funds from that overall account of those monies to be spent. So it's not raising new taxes or anything. The extractive industry is already taxed, and it's the money off those industries that would be used to acquire those mineral rights. So I've seen on the National Parks Conservation Association website, one of the main reason that they're advocating for the designation is to stop oil extraction. We don't need to go down that road because the ball is already rolling. The tribe is working very hard to get those rights acquired.
What's their response when you tell them that? Initially,
I do not feel that they realized the amount of people that lived here and the tribes. I honestly think they didn't take into consideration the Miccosukee or Seminole tribes that we live out here. A lot of people of the public don't realize that there's tribes out here. They think it's just a vast wilderness and nobody is here. And it has been brought to their attention that the wilderness designation is a bit racial, discrimination going on. It's a very racist policy. think that they thought of that. They're just thinking, oh, we're going to protect this landscape. They didn't realize how discriminatory it is.
Right.
And
Because specifically because you're saying, for people who are listening and saying, how's that racial?
one of the requirements for wilderness designation that an area is untrammeled by human beings. Miccosukee and Seminole people are human beings.
Right.
So in that statement, untrammeled by human beings, and here we are with Miccosukee and Seminoles and other tribes that came before us who have been in this landscape, have altered the landscape, whether building their chicky huts, whether they were farming, whether the Calusa were digging their canals to traverse the landscape. Indigenous people and then people after us, even the first earlier settlers, have altered the landscape. So how can you say it meets the criteria of untrammeled by human beings, where man is a visitor?
When it comes to what other conservation groups are feeling about this wilderness designation, Betty did not hold back. Many of these groups are also deeply uneasy with this new proposal that takes, quote, fortress conservation, end quote, as a feasible solution for preservation.
I'm a human being. The rest of the Miccosukee tribe, old members are human beings. The Seminole tribe of Florida, their members are human beings, as is all our descendants. We are human beings. I live here in the Big Cypress National Preserve, and I say I trammel this section of the preserve every day. I live here and carry out my daily activities of living here. We are impacting this environment in some way. Also, too, fortress conservation does not work here. You have many state agencies opposed to the designation and citing that it would hinder their ability to actively manage this landscape. And even the South Florida Water Management has expressed their concerns and opposition to this proposed designation because of Western Everglades restoration. Because in order to do the restoration work, they are going to have to dredge and fill and put in culverts and infrastructure to facilitate Everglades restoration. So not only will it hurt the indigenous people and divest them from their landscape, it's going to interfere with Western Everglades restoration, which is a part of the overall restoration of the Everglades, where state and the federal government have spent millions upon millions of dollars to undo the damage. And yet here you have an entity, I don't think they understand the far-reaching implications of what they were advocating for.
Betty has been a frequent critic of the quick fix-it mentality that seems to be prevalent in conservation work. She instead encourages allies to take up a more indigenous healing framework. I asked Betty to talk a little bit more about this and the long connections and stories indigenous people have of the land and water, such that they are hyper aware of what is hurting and how healing can even begin through active human management and caretaking.
You know, the individuals in support of the wilderness designation and the agencies, they're not from this landscape. They don't have that historical ancestral connection to this landscape. They don't live here.
Right.
They live in an urban area somewhere.
Right.
So I can understand how they don't understand the importance of having to heal a landscape, and because they weren't raised in the mindset to understand the environment, the ecosystem, you have to look at it as if it were a human being as yourself. Because if you're sick, you go to the doctor and you have signs and symptoms that you're sick, whether it's physically or mentally. Here in the ecosystem, there's signs and symptoms of it that is sick. And you have to understand what that ecosystem is capable of and what it's doing and functioning as when it's healthy versus when it's unhealthy, when it's ailing. And that's a connection that's understood and learned over time. In some cases over decades and centuries, it's passed down. Example, the Big Cypress National Preserve. When your ancestors are telling you that it used to have a lot more birds, it used to have a lot more wildlife, whether they were deer, possum, raccoon, and even snakes, that there was a lot more abundance in wildlife. And today you're not seeing that abundance as wildlife. Also, too, when you understand the Melaleuca tree is not native to here, it was brought in. The Brazilian pepper is not native to here, it was brought in. You have lygodium, you have air potato, you have different plants that are not native to here that have now made its way into the Big Cypress National Preserve and other parts of Florida. When you have fish that are not native to this environment, you have the native fish of the, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, you have garfish, you have bowfin, and those are native to here. But when you're seeing the Mayan cichlids, when you're seeing snakeheads, when you're seeing, armored catfish, even goldfish, and you're seeing all these fish that are aquarium fish that are now out here. So now you have other species of fish competing with the native species. When you see the Melaleuca that historically was planted to drain the Everglades for development, it takes over. It grows in such a way that no other plant can grow within it. The same as Brazilian pepper, it grows in such a way that it displaces all other plant life. And so those species are here. And even the python, how it eats anything, and it's consuming a lot of food. So if you were to propose a wilderness designation, and if it were to pass, basically you're consigning the Big Cypress Preserve, the rest of this environment that's ailing, to die. Because those invasive species, flora and fauna, need active management. Also, too, the landscape needs to have natural cycles of fire. Right. Historically, nature did that with lightning strikes.
Right.
Now, because everything is so altered, mankind has had to step in to assist in that process of putting fire in the ground. And even scientists, you hinder their ability to adequately understand an ecosystem and how they need to go in and do their sampling to get their data. Whether it's trying to see, looking at snail kites, whether it's looking at the apple snails, whether it's looking at the raccoons, possums, bear, panther, everything, those take active management. So when you put something behind lock and key, you hinder those abilities to do so. And some of these organizations say, look at Everglades National Park, how great it's flourishing. Everglades National Park is not flourishing at all. It's further declining. They haven't helped Everglades National Park move forward in a return in abundance of the wildlife it used to have, of the plant life it used to have. And you're seeing further encroachment of, look at climate change and sea level rise. Right. Those are going to take active management on our part somehow.
Right.
And for us, with the 7 generations mentality a lot of tribes have, my culture, we don't really talk about 7 generations. We say from now into your future generations into eternity. So it's more than 7 generations. It doesn't have an end date to that. So we're always looking down the road of what those impacts would be. And at the bottom line, human beings tend to forget that they are part of the ecosystem. There's this mentality that human beings are not a part of the ecosystem. They are above the ecosystem. Right. But the very definition of an ecosystem includes human beings. Right.
For Betty, she says water is land. This is a concept that might be hard for non-Indigenous people, and it might sound a little bit odd because they are often categorically seen as distinct entities. But Betty is teaching us that there's a flow between them, and it can help us to reshape the way that we are thinking about preservation, conservation, and active solutions for healing.
And a lot of times people only think of water in the liquid form. They don't understand water is also land. And because water is in the soil, it's in the trees, outside of the liquid form. and how we have an imbalance of water now globally because of the loss of these landscapes. The Everglades that people know today, they only know what's in Everglades National Park,
Right.
the boundaries of Everglades National Park. They don't understand that the historic Greater Everglades ecosystem was Miami-Dade County, all the way up to the beach, was Broward County, all the way up to the beach, portions of West Palm Beach, all the way up to the beach, and even on the West Coast, Collier County, all the way into Naples and towards Fort Myers, and that Greater Everglades ecosystem. And so when we're talking about climate change and sea level rise, we're seeing it now in Miami-Dade County. If Miami-Dade County were never developed and there was no impediment to water flow from, the Kissimmee chain of lakes into Lake Okeechobee, and it could just overflow, it would have flowed down through all the residences of today that make up Miami-Dade County. If Miami-Dade County wasn't developed like it is, there wouldn't be impediment to that water flow. And water could make it out to the coast. And water wouldn't be sent down to the St. Lucie estuary or the Caloosahatchee. It would have had its historic flow. But because mankind has altered natural flow, that's why we have canals and levees here in Florida today, is to remove water off landscapes, to have agriculture, and to have places for people to live. So water, natural flow was starting to get disrupted as a matter of trying to protect your food. And because of that drainage effort, you had urban areas created. Then you had the effort to connect Tampa to Miami. So now you have the Tamiami Trail, which basically was building a dam across Florida, which was an impediment to water flow. And then later on, you had the building of I-75, which was another impediment to water flow. And so then you come to, the Big Cypress National Preserve and Everglades National Park, who need water. But you have all these impediments to water. And a lot of people don't understand 40% of the water that goes down and makes its way to Florida Bay comes through the area that is known as the Big Cypress National Preserve. So when you look at the changing climate and the encroachment of water, when you go down to Everglades National Park, there around Florida Bay, they're already starting to see that changes of plant life. They're now seeing more saltwater plants in areas that were historically freshwater plants. Water is encroaching further inland. And in Miami-Dade County itself, they already have saltwater intrusion in some of their drinking water wells. So the flow of the water through the remaining Everglades, which is Everglades National Park, the Big Cypress National Preserve, all the water conservation areas, water needs to flow. So here in the Big Cypress National Preserve, that 40% water flow will be impacted by a wilderness designation and will take away from the effort to restore the water flow, but also combat sea level rise. Slow it down. It's going to happen, but it's going to impede the efforts to slow it down enough so nature has time to adapt and to be able to survive in those future scenarios. 3 miles. Water has come in 3 miles over time. But you don't realize it because it gradually happens. So here in Florida, people are like, okay, what does that have to do with the wilderness designation? To look at these changes and understand them is going to have to take active participation, active management, and be proactive. If you just throw away the lock and key, you're going to help exacerbate that process. So I do airboat tours, and during the tour, we kept stopping to pick up balloons. Even though there's a law passed, people are still letting go those Mylar balloons. So we were picking up balloons, and as we traveled, we were out there for a considerable amount of time. And I said, Okay, you see this balloon? Yeah. I said, just imagine if the area that we're in was a wilderness designation and you and I could not be out here in this airboat. Imagine how many these balloons would not have been picked up, and imagine how many more balloons would end up in this part of the ecosystem because nobody was able to be out here. And she said, oh my God. So if no one is allowed into an area, they'll say, oh, you can hike in there, you can do this and that, but some of the things that you need to actively manage a landscape cannot be carried in. It has to be transported somehow.
That's a really strong example, I think. And I think maybe with these folks who created this designation are thinking that any human presence is going to be a negative presence, and they're not thinking about the generations of caretaking and love and the need for, you know, having clean water so you can thrive, right? And so there's that idea, like, if you're going to be in there, you're going to treat it badly. There's that assumption, you know.
At one time, years ago, at my business location, there was this alligator, and it was swimming around, and we're like, what is that on its head? It turned out that I guess someone maybe tried to poach the alligator, but it had like a tip of like a harpoon stuck in its head. It was modified to have like a casing from like a shotgun shell. And we're like, oh my God, we need to help this alligator. So we made a phone call to our tribal wildlife officers, and they came and got a rope so they were able to pull up the alligator. And they had the ability to use some type of pliers, like needle nose, but really good sized ones, to be able to grab it and pull it out of the alligators. It was embedded right behind it. It's in its neck there, and they pulled it out. So I'm like, well, if we hadn't been there and we hadn't seen this alligator, people could say, oh, because of humankind, if they weren't allowed there, he wouldn't have got shot. But alligators traverse through water. So he could have gotten shot somewhere way far away in his home range and made his way to where we are, and we just happened to see it. If we weren't there to be able to call for help and to get these wildlife officers to come help this alligator, he would still be swimming around with that tip of a little harpoon embedded in his head, you know. And alligators are very resilient animals, and he would have been about his day. But why should an alligator have to swim around with you know, a piece of metal in his head?
The work and this labor of care that you are imploring us all to be a part of, it's a beautiful one, it's deep, and it takes so much time and energy. And for people who are listening to this and thinking, like, what can I do? How do I be a part of this structure of care, of healing? You know, are you asking them to go to their local representatives? Are you asking them to make changes in their daily practices? What are ways that people can be involved and understand what this designation means for them too? Because I can see how some people might say, well, it doesn't involve me, so why should I be involved?
Well, first, it does involve you.
Exactly.
Because it's not just the indigenous people, it's all people of the public. Their access would be restricted. So it does involve you. Maybe you don't personally come out here or take that time, but if you have children, one day your children, or anybody in your family or somebody that you know, in order to protect an environment, you have to interact with that environment. You have to experience it to love that environment, because you protect what you know. We're asking individuals to contact members of Congress, because there are 2 bills in the House and the Senate, and that need to be heard by Congress to stop this process. I have been asking also people reach out to the NPCA and express their concerns to the National Parks Conservation Association. You can also go to local government. The preserve is a federal preserve, but it's within a county. So the county commissioners have expressed their concern. even though, the preserve is mainly in Collier County, there are portions of it in Monroe County and Miami-Dade County. So individuals can go to the Miami-Dade County commissioners to express their concern about the wilderness designation. And I want to be clear, just because a tribe is opposing a wilderness designation does not mean that we are against conservation. Mm-hmm. What we're saying is, instead of trying to displace indigenous people, work with us.
Right.
Let us help you understand this landscape. And the tribe itself is actively trying to heal its landscapes on its federal lands to reintroduce different flora and fauna. So the tribe itself, using their traditional ecological knowledge, ITEC as people like to say, can be very helpful to other organizations. And currently, even the National Park Service understands that the importance, and they have started collaborating with the tribe and also doing some cultural education to park staff. Mm-hmm. But it goes beyond that. Even in the management of an area, just like recently it was signed for co-management of Everglades National Park with the Miccosukee tribe. Here in the Big Cypress National Preserve, instead of removing the indigenous people can be co-stewards, co-managers of the Big Cypress National Preserve, because we're making positive gains on our own federal reservations to heal the landscape, to bring back the plant and the animals, and we're being successful. Here, the preserve has a history of, well, if it's not flourishing wildlife, we just need to close off a zone. They're not trying to actively heal the landscape. Their solution is just to shut it off.
Right.
You know, basically putting the patient on the deathbed in ICU and not having nurses check on them, just having them there to die. So here, instead of closing off zones, they can actually work with the tribes so that the tribes can help them and give them insight on how we've been successful. So it gets back to a place where you're seeing more wildlife thrive. You're seeing the native plant life thrive. But even myself, having grown up into it, there's always room to understand more about it's a lifelong process of understanding and connection that has to be fostered. It's only been in recent times that all the federal agencies must consider in the ITEC, the Indigenous, traditional ecological knowledge in their decision making. And that has kind of helped open to the door in those spaces on the state level too, that, Indigenous people have a right to be heard, and that the knowledge that they have is also important. It's not just Western science. But the downside is that they want to fit Indigenous knowledge, taking a circle and trying to fit it into a square peg. Right. That is not valid if it doesn't meet the standards of Western science. There's still that hurdle to cross.
Mm-hmm. Because they're they're defining what is important to them.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
So we still have a lot. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is fascinating. I mean, I've heard you talk about this designation, but it's still, there's so many moving parts to it, and now I'm starting to understand it a little bit better. For me, I'm also connecting it to the broader history of states and political entities ignoring Indigenous people, making them sacrificable even when they see them, and then making promises and breaking them. And it's upsetting, it's upsetting. And I hope that our listeners are upset by this as well. And I hope that you go out and actually go onto these websites, look at the language, look at how vague some of the solutions are. Betty, you had mentioned when you were on the website, there was, you said that they've now are a little bit trying to clean up some of the language because there's been such an outcry.
When the wilderness designation was, when we found out about it years later, the tribe itself, because I was in the room, met with Pedro Ramos, the superintendent of Everglades National Park and the Dry Tortugas, and oversees the Big Cypress National Preserve. When the tribe expressed their concerns about it, basically, he told the tribe that, he heard the concerns, understands the concerns, but they're moving forward anyways with their recommendation. Okay, I hear you, but we're doing it anyways. I'm not talking for the tribe, but that's how I personally took it. When you research how the wilderness designation process came about and who was the author of the designation and the language and what this author meant by untrammeled by human beings, it wasn't an indigenous person. It was an individual that visited different areas. Yes, he loved those areas, but he was not of the area. He didn't live there. He didn't consult with indigenous tribes or whatever. It was a visitor to the landscape, feeling that these designations need to occur to help the landscapes, to protect them. And he was a visitor, so he felt everybody else should be a visitor. He didn't take into account that we live here.
Right.
Indigenous people, their culture, their history, their stories, their identity are all interwoven and connected with the land.
Yes.
And that includes food.
Right.
And also our medicinal plants that we gather from the landscape. So if we're depending on this landscape, we want this landscape to thrive, to continue to have those medicinal plants, to continue to support the different animal populations that we depend on and that we historically ate. And another a point that I wanted to put in there, I think it was very interesting how there's people of the public think that indigenous people should no longer eat their traditional foods, that we have enough money to buy food. We can go to Publix to buy our food. So to me, that's like, okay, so you still want us to assimilate to your culture versus respecting and accepting our culture. Wilderness designations lead into the assimilation movement of indigenous people and the colonization of indigenous people. There is a lot going on in this world, but to be more aware of what's going on in your own backyard, we tend to get focused on issues that are on a broader level and not on a local level. Do the research and make an informed decision. And just because an organization may say, we need to back this amendment, we need to back this project, find out for yourself. Don't blindly follow. Find out for yourself about the project or whatever that movement is, to see if it's something that should be done. Sometimes people put out fact sheets that are opinion sheets. So
That's
find
true.
the actual facts. Don't take what someone says it being fact. I always even say for myself, if I say something, go and research it. Fact check me on that. And so to make that informed decision. I know it takes time in today's world. I'm not going to say generation, but today's world, people are so pressed for lack of time that they'll just scan something and not really try to fully understand it. They get their information in sound bites, and that's not always a good thing.
I just saw this quote. I'm going to read it to you because I think you'll like it. It's from Cole Riley. She said, "Presence is not solidarity. Knowledge is not solidarity. Solidarity is a kind of unity that costs you something." And I love that. And that quote reminds me of what you're saying here is it's not going to be easy all the time, right? It's going to cost, and it might be uncomfortable, but you have to be willing to give up something in order for a more humanistic way of moving forward together. And every time I hear you, I think of this quote, and I appreciate.
Because sometimes I get like, why should I care? I'm like, it's your fellow human being.
Right.
You should care.
Yeah.
It's not impacting me. Why should I care?
Right.
And I think that's people forget. Maybe it's not impacting you directly, but it's impacting you indirectly as well.
Thank you so much, Betty. This is powerful.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the Commons for Justice and to listen to our other episodes, go to commonsforjustice.fiu.edu. If you'd like to learn more about the Global Indigenous Forum or more about this podcast, Unblocked, please follow us on Instagram at FIU_GIF or go to our website, indigenous.fiu.edu. This episode was produced by me, Mitzi Uehara Carter. The audio engineer for the show is Diane Benitez. The audio and post-production editing was done by Sebastian Rocha Alvarez. Thank you to the Mellon Foundation's Just Future Initiatives for their support on this podcast.